Hello, my name is Ana Lucia and I'm a student at Tech Millennium, and this is the 10th activity of Contemporary World. Today I will be talking about the Cold War, which was a period of high tension between what, for the purpose of this presentation, I'll refer to as the Eastern and the Western Bloc, which were basically the Soviet Union and the US, alongside their respective allies, of course. The reason for this geopolitical tension was the result of a competition for global power and the expansion, or on the other side, repression of different political systems. Now, I want to quickly explain why I refer to this conflict only as a high tension period when its name mentions war. The thing is, in this particular war, there wasn't any direct military action between the conflicting nations. The measures taken were mostly through propaganda, acts of espionage, and proxy wars. This resulted in, as the financier Bernard Baruch said, chilly relations between the US and the Soviet Union, which is why the term Cold War is used to describe this period. Alright, so these are some important dates of this war. There is still some debate regarding the exact start date, but I wanted to begin with the Yalta Conference in February of 1949, because I believe this was when animosity between the countries started to become clear. During this conference, the representatives of the big three allies of World War II, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Soviet leader Stalin, got together to discuss the future of Europe after the possibility of winning World War II became realistic. And one of the many issues that were left unattended was the political future of Poland, for the Soviets favored a communist political system, but the US and the UK didn't. Next date is the nuclear attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US orchestrated these bombings with the purpose of forcing Japan to surrender. And then there was also the added possibility that it would pressure the USSR to negotiate over Germany and Eastern Europe. But it all actually had the opposite effect. Because US President Truman did not inform Stalin of these bombings, and therefore didn't let him participate nor gain any rights of occupation after Japan's surrender, Stalin's anger and suspicion of the West grew, and the USSR distanced itself even more. After the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks, Stalin's desire to have his own nuclear weapons increased. So, 4 years later of investigation and development, the Soviets had their first atomic bomb testing on the 29th of August in 1949. By the time 1952 came, the nuclear power competition was getting more and more intense. Now that the US knew that with enough time and resources, more developed nations could have their own nuclear bombs as well, they felt a need to up their game. So, President Truman decided to support the development of what would later be known as the Hell Bomb. The first test in the world of a hydrogen bomb was given the name of Mike, and it was detonated on November 1 of 1952. The destruction was such that it instantly vaporized an entire island, and the crater left behind measured more than a mile wide. Fast forward almost 10 years later, and the Soviets had developed what still is the most powerful nuclear weapon ever created and tested. It goes by the name of Tsar Bomb, though it may also be known as Big Ivan or other titles. This bomb was detonated on October 30 of 1961. The explosion was so powerful that the damage was felt in many Soviet districts that were as far as hundreds of miles from the blast zone. Windows were shattered, roofs fell, and houses collapsed. Even radio communication stopped working for more than an hour. I mentioned earlier that during this war, there wasn't any direct military action between the Eastern and the Western Bloc. But on this next important date, which is October of 1962, people all over the world were scared because this was the closest the the power nations got to start a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as we now call it, was a confrontation that lasted 13 days. Basically, the USSR started to install nuclear missiles in Cuba, and because of its proximity with the US, well, the US didn't like it. So they negotiated, and at the end, the Soviets removed the missiles. By 1989, this war had already stretched for too many decades, and people were tired. It had become obvious that the USSR could no longer support the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, so November 9 of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the process of reuniting Germany as a single state began. This moment marked the end of the Cold War, or at least a symbolic one, all around the world. Okay, now, even though many consider the official end of the Cold War to have happened on December 3rd of 1989, when US President George Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met at a Soviet ship, I personally wanted to mention the collapse of the Soviet Union as the last important date. So, in comparison to the rest of this conflict, the dissolution of the USSR was pretty anticlimactic. Because after the implementation of radical reforms by Gorbachev, most of the republics that conformed the Soviet Union declared that they would establish a Commonwealth of Independent States. And just like that, the once mighty Soviet Union ceased to exist. On December 25th of 1999, its flag flew one last time above the Kremlin in Moscow. I've said that one of the main reasons of this conflict was the establishment of two different political systems, so it seems only logical that now I explain them. First, we have capitalism, which is the economic system that the West Bloc defended. The term capitalism is often attributed to Karl Marx, but he didn't actually support it. It was Adam Smith, the philosopher, who is often identified as the father of modern capitalism. This system is based on private ownership of the industry and trade of a state, instead of it belonging to the government. And some of its pillars or characteristics are private property, which means that people are allowed to own tangible and intangible assets, competition, which gives both customers and producers more freedom to choose in the market, and a limited role of the government. This is to make sure that the rights of private citizens and the points above are maintained. On the other side, we have socialism, which is the political, economic, and social philosophy that the East Bloc defended. It is attributed to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels when they wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Now, the basic idea of socialism is that the workers own the means of production, which means that society as a whole equally owns and/or regulates all their assets. All this, of course, allocated by a democratically elected government. Now, don't confuse it with communism, which is a common mistake. In communism, most property and resources are owned and controlled by the state, and in socialism, by the people. Some of the main characteristics of socialism are, public ownership, which is the foundation of this whole ideology. There's also economic planning, which means that unlike in a capitalist society, in which the economy is regulated by supply and demand, in socialism, all economic activities are regulated by a central authority, which is usually the government. There's also the provision of basic needs, like, for example, food and shelter. This is supposed to be equally distributed without discrimination to all citizens by the government. And lastly, no competition, because there are no private producers, only one. So consumer choice in the market is reduced. Okay, so those were the two models of political systems. Now, for the interview I conducted, the subject was my dad. His name is Gustavo and he's 53 years old. The first question I asked him was, what countries were the world leaders during this period? And he answered Russia and the USA. Then I asked him if he knew these countries used to be allies in World War II, and he said that yes, they fought against the Germans. Then I asked him if he knew why did they become enemies, but he wasn't sure about it. Then fourth question was, did the Cold War affect the whole world? And he replied, not really. I mean, in the way that most of the world kept expecting the next move from these superpowers, then yes. But the whole world wasn't involved, so not actually. Then I asked about his opinion on the Cold War, and if it matched the general one of the people around him. And he said that yes, most people around him, including him, were on the side of the US. And the last question was, from your point of view, did it seem that the possible detonation of these nuclear weapons could affect your daily life, and why or why not? And he said that yes, it would have affected everyone's life, because Mexico is dependent on the US for many things. So if they would have been bombed, the crisis would have affected us as well. Okay, to finish off, here's my opinion of the war and the two systems that I discussed. So the war, I guess it must have been like really scary for all the citizens, for example, of these countries involved, because there was a lot of tension of it will suddenly, start bombing each other, and the citizens couldn't do anything about it. So I guess they must have lived really scared and felt powerless. But on the other side, like the scientists that developed the whole nuclear weapons and like that, I guess that must have been kind of exciting, though at the same time scary, because there were huge developments. These were really, really powerful weapons, so that must have been surprising. Sorry. Overall, I'm just glad that casualties were kept to a minimum during this war. That's my main take from it. Now, from the both political systems, capitalism and socialism, that we discussed, I think each of them have their pros and their cons. I don't think any has resulted like perfectly, because, for example, a really capitalist country I think right now would be the US, but it has it has problems. This market economic idea, there are recessions, there's inequality, big corporations control a lot of things. Those are some things that aren't usually taken into account, I think, when discussing the pros of capitalism. Those are some cons. And then socialism would sound good if there was actually equality for everyone, but then it can lead to authoritarian governments. It has usually led to authoritarian governments. Cuba, I think it's a good example of that. So yeah, neither one is perfect. That's my last take. And thank you. This is the end of this presentation.